If sleep serves specific needs, then we will have developed genetics, the genetics that control our biology and biological processes, to help control sleep and help our brain be designed so that it controls sleep and waking. And that also means that if REM sleep and non-REM sleep have different functions, they also then have different control points in the brain. Now, scientists are actually just kind of guessing sometimes on how our brain does actually control sleep, primarily because we're limited in trying to really measure things in a brain of an awake, alert individual. We can't use animal models to study what happens during REM sleep because a lot of that is subjective. The dream state and what's experienced by an individual typically has to be shared. That's not something that can be shared with most animals or the animal models that we might be able to use. So let's first of all talk about what the brain consists of, and then we'll talk about how the different brain structures may control arousal and waking, REM sleep, and non-REM sleep. So first and foremost, brain cells, those are called neurons. Neurons are specialized cells that are designed to communicate information. And so we have to communicate information over space in your body. So that means that what's going to happen is each neuron it's kind of structured like a tree. It brings in information from other neurons and other sensory organs through dendrites. So when you stub your toe, the sensory or pressure system triggers dendrites and sensory neurons. Those neurons then trigger something called an action potential, but it's an electrical impulse that travels up the length of that neuron. And for us, if we stubbed our toe, that means that sensory neuron is transmitting that information up our leg toward our spinal cord so that eventually the information can get to our brain. That neuron's going to have to synapse or communicate with other neurons. And so it's going to release neurochemicals from axon terminals. Those neurochemicals are going to cross this small space called a synapse and then bind to the dendritic region of other neurons. When you've used microscopes in the past, you've probably looked at cells that are kind of blocky in shape and have a nucleus. And all cells, including our brain cells, have nuclei with genetic material in it. But you've probably seen cells under microscopes that are kind of blocky. Well, those are skin cells. They're serving the purpose of creating a barrier, so they kind of align in rectangular blocks. A neuron's purpose is to communicate information, and that's why it's laid out the way it is. Neurons use neurotransmitters as chemical signals. They release from these axon terminals so that it can share the message or pass the message on to the next neuron, and also things called neuromodulators. So importantly to remember, these neurotransmitters and neuromodulators, they're going to be synthesized in the neuron. They're going to be released from the axon terminal. They're going to influence neurons, and for neurotransmitters, those neurons have to be in the immediate vicinity or very close in physical proximity to our releasing neuron. For neuromodulators, these are chemicals that can travel further and diffuse broader or wider through the area. Importantly, these chemical messages are only part of how brain cells communicate information. And so neurons, as I mentioned, within a neuron, relay a message through space or its axon electrically. And then when it gets to the end, communicating to the next neuron in the sequence, it's going to release these chemical messengers. Now, each neuron is going to be located or housed in structures or places that define what its purpose is, what kind of information it's going to be relaying. And that means that it's also going to control what kind of neurotransmitter it releases. So each neuron will typically make and release only one primary type of neurotransmitter. And that's because The receiving neurons have to build receptors for neurotransmitters. They have to actually receive them at the surface of their cells. And that requires something like a catcher's mitt to be built on the outside of a cell. Well, receiving neurons can't make receptors for every conceivable neurotransmitter, so we streamline things by having neurons that exist in the same structure, doing roughly the same kinds of tasks, using the same neurotransmitter. So what kind of neurotransmitters do we have? Well, you've probably heard of them in the past. So we have things like acetylcholine, and that's a neurotransmitter that's often used at the synapses between neurons and muscle fibers, so we have motor neurons controlling muscle fibers. We have dopamine, norepinephrine, and epinephrine. We have serotonin, melatonin in this class is going to be an important one. We also have things like glutamate, a very excitatory neurotransmitter. It helps rile your brain up, and GABA, which helps calm your brain down. And then we have a lot of other substances, neuropeptides, gaseotransmitters. These are things, the neuropeptides in particular are neuromodulators, and they're things like endorphins. You may have heard of a runner's high. Well, that's releasing an endorphin. But what we're going to pay attention to is how some of these major neurotransmitters are part of the systems that keep us awake and alert, and the systems that help essentially calm us down, fall into non-REM sleep, and then reactivate some areas for REM sleep. Okay, so what chemicals are involved in the sleep-wake issues in the brain? Well, acetylcholine, not only does it deal with motor neurons and muscle fibers, but it also has roles in learning and memory and waking and REM sleep. Adenosine, which builds up in our waking state, and it's also what caffeine blocks. So adenosine receptors should bind to neurons and help signal that people are sleepy. And as adenosine builds up, it would bind to more receptors, but caffeine blocks those receptors, and that's why we don't feel as sleepy after we have caffeine. Importantly, the basal forebrain area, and we'll get to pictures of where that is in a while, adenosine levels in, and we actually want to correct that, adenosine levels in the basal forebrain probably help influence how much we sleep, because the basal forebrain is going to be really important in triggering us to fall asleep. Dopamine looks like it contributes to waking and REM sleep. GABA, as I mentioned, it's a major inhibitory neurotransmitter in the brain. And so it decreases activity. It has a calming effect, and that may be very important for falling into non-REM sleep. It also helps your brain start to produce sleep spindles and delta waves, those areas, those kinds of waveforms that signal that we're falling into a sleep-like state. Glutamate is the yin to GABA's yang. So yin-yang, we've got GABA being the major inhibitory neurotransmitter. Glutamate's the major excitatory neurotransmitter in the brain and the spinal cord. Together, the brain and spinal cord make up the central nervous system. Neurons that exist outside the brain and spinal cord, because I just talked about how when you stub your toe, you have to have a sensory neuron bring that information into your spinal cord so that you can be consciously aware of it. It has to get up to your brain. Those neurons exist in what we call the peripheral nervous system. They exist outside the brain and spinal cord. Glycine is a major inhibitory neurotransmitter in the spinal cord itself, and it looks to be responsible for keeping us from not acting out our dreams. So it causes muscle paralysis during REM sleep. There are other chemicals that you may not have heard a lot of when you talk about neuroscience because they're so sleep specific. So histamine produces wakefulness. You may be familiar with taking antihistamine drugs, and those actually produce drowsiness. So that's when you want to probably prevent an allergic reaction. You might get sleepy with antihistamine drugs. So histamine produces wakefulness. Oroxin produces wakefulness as well, and it's produced by a structure in the middle of the brain called the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus controls the pituitary gland, and the pituitary gland releases a lot of hormones, controls a lot of hormones. And so the hypothalamus controls hormones. Remember H and H. Hormones exist on a circadian rhythm, a 24-hour cycle typically, sometimes a monthly cycle. But we definitely need those hormones to cycle through the day and through the month. And so the hypothalamus also has information about circadian rhythms because it gets information from the eyes. And we'll come back to that. Importantly, you might have heard of a sleep disorder called narcolepsy, where people have uncontrollable sleep attacks. Well, it looks like genes responsible for oroxin may be in some way mutated in individuals with narcolepsy, or may not make oroxin as successfully, and that may be why individuals with narcolepsy have sleep attacks. But here's the trick. Oroxin seems to be really specific for preventing REM sleep during waking. And so what actually happens during a sleep attack during narcolepsy is someone with narcolepsy falls into a REM state in their sleep very rapidly. So typically as part of the sleep cycle, you would start having non-REM sleep, and then over 90 to 100 minutes, introduce some REM sleep, and then throughout the rest of the night, in these 90 to 100 minute blocks of time, you would introduce more and more REM sleep as a proportion of that block. With someone with narcolepsy, they can fall into a sleep attack and immediately fall into REM sleep. And so what we think is happening in narcolepsy is some issues with this particular chemical that promotes wakefulness. Okay. Well, if we're going to stay awake, we have to project to lots of different areas of the brain. So the hypothalamus, which mostly controls hormones through the pituitary gland, will also have neurons that project throughout the rest of the brain. And those neurons help in us paying attention to our environment. They help in us keeping awake and alert. And they may also help in us paying attention to reward things in our environment. Is there food? Is there a pretty girl or a pretty boy? Are there pretty flowers? These are things we want to pay attention to. Okay, and just as a side note, I'll come back exactly to what this image of the brain is from, but in general, this is a brain cut in half so that we can see the hypothalamus because it's in the center of the brain. And here's where your eyes would be at the front, and here's where the back of your head is. Some of you may have heard of the cerebellum. Back here, it kind of looks like a cauliflower stalk stuck at the back of your brain stem. We'll come back to these images of the brain later in this lecture. Other neurochemicals that are important, we got norepinephrine. Norepinephrine is about vigilance and paying attention to your environment. And amphetamines actually increase norepinephrine. The main structure that causes arousal and vigilance in your brain, specifically the brain stem, is an area called the locus coeruleus, and the neurons in that area that make up that structure use a lot of norepinephrine. Serotonin, you may be familiar with. We often take antidepressants called serotonin reuptake inhibitors. That's what Prozac is. Well, serotonin appears to have a calming effect. And in fact, as serotonin decreases, aggression, hostility, and depression can result. And you might say to yourself, well, what's depression got to do with aggression? Well, depression is actually a form of kind of self-aggression. It's filled with thoughts of individuals not feeling like they can do anything or be successful. And so we might conceptualize depression as self-aggression to a certain degree. But serotonin particularly released from the raphe nucleus, once again in the brainstem area in the center of the brain. Well, it helps promote wakefulness, but also has an important role in REM sleep. And so we also have neuromodulators like immune system responses. Remember, you probably get sleepy when you get sick, and that's probably to conserve energy. And then you may have heard of melatonin. Melatonin is a neuropeptide. It increases in the brain about 2 hours before bedtime and remains high up until about when you typically wake up. And we think melatonin chemicals are in the way your brain syncs different structures so that it's an internal Zeitgeber. It's what your body's time clock is all about. Once again, we have this image of the brain with slightly different details here. Once again, we've sliced the brain in half. The front of the brain, your eyes would be here. The back of your head is here. This is that cerebellum, that cauliflower-like structure at the back of your head. And here in the middle, on this brain stem, we would have the hypothalamus, we have the pituitary, but we also, back in the middle, have the pineal gland. And the pineal gland is where melatonin comes from. So we have a lot of control of sleep and waking happening here in this brainstem area. Now, you may have heard that melatonin could be effective in helping alleviate some effects of jet lag or shift work. The jury's still a little out on what synthetic melatonin could actually do to help. But importantly, the other aspect of what's happening in the middle of your brain right here is the optic chiasm happens. The optic chiasm is where information from your eye moves to the back of your head, because it's actually the back of your head where you're going to process a lot of your vision. And so it makes sense that neurons coming from the eye go through this brainstem, middle of your brain area, and in fact we have a substructure in the hypothalamus called the suprachiasmatic nucleus, and all that means is it's a smaller structure, a nucleus within the hypothalamus, and its neurons connect to the eye and we think help control circadian rhythms. Okay, so what about some basic brain anatomy? Because I've been throwing around terms like the brain stem. Well, once again, your brain stem is this structure that sits on top of your spinal cord. So here's your spinal cord. Your skull would be here. And so the brain stem is completely within the skull. So the brain stem is part of your brain. But because it sits on top of the spinal cord, and it acts like a stem that the rest of your brain grows around during development, we often think of the brainstem as having some very rudimentary structures and tasks. So the brainstem has the medulla, the pons, and the midbrain. The medulla controls things like respiration and your heart rate. And in fact, that's why if you get a concussion and your brain starts to swell, it puts pressure on this medulla. And if we put pressure on this kind of structure, we might inhibit its ability to act, which means that's why we get so worried with people with concussions, because they may actually fall into a coma, decreased arousal, or have difficulties with respiration or cardiac control if the medulla gets compressed against the bottom of your skull. Now, importantly, here's the brainstem blown up from this image, and you can see here's that cerebellum, which we're not really going to deal with. I just was kind of using it as a landmark. There's this long structure that exists throughout your entire brainstem, and it's called the reticular formation. That reticular formation is very important for controlling the sleep-wake cycle. Everything else outside this brainstem, so if the brainstem is a stem and your brain grows around it during development, well, we call that your forebrain, your cerebral cortex, and it's the outer surface that surrounds the brainstem. So right on top of the brainstem is the diencephalon. So once again, here we have our medulla, our pons, our midbrain, and on top of that is something called the diencephalon. Di meaning two. So there's two structures, one of which is the hypothalamus. We've already talked about the hypothalamus. It has to exist close to the pituitary gland because it's going to control what the pituitary gland does for hormone release. And the thalamus. Even though these structures are named very similarly, hypothalamus and thalamus, they actually don't do anything similar. They just exist next to each other. The hypothalamus, once again, controls hormones. And then the thalamus, well, it's like a sensory warehouse. So one of the reasons the image, the optic chiasm, and the neurons from the eye come through this location is because vision, being a sensation or a sense, has to come through the thalamus before it projects to the back of the brain toward your occipital lobe, the area where you deal with vision. So this thalamus is going to integrate, filter sensory information, including ears, taste, all that stuff. We care about it for vision because obviously for most people, or for actually all people that we know of, dreams consist of visual stimuli. And so that thalamus must be in some way reactivated during REM sleep. Okay, so diencephalon. Di for two. Encephalon is brain matter. So two brain structures containing the thalamus and the hypothalamus right on top of that brain stem. Technically, these two structures are in the forebrain area or in the cerebral cortex. They're not listed in the brainstem, but they sit right on top of it. Once again, the hypothalamus controls hormones. The technical term for that system in your body is the endocrine system, but it also controls the autonomic nervous system, all the stuff that just keeps you chugging along. And when I say it controls it, what I mean is the medulla is in charge of things like your heart rate and respiration, the motor control. The hypothalamus helps regulate how fast that's going to happen, because the hypothalamus will say things like, there's a bear over there and we have to run away from it, so let's get our heart rate going faster. Let's shut down digestion. Let's make sure we can do what we need to do. And all of that has to happen automatically. Can't think about it. So the other trick is the hypothalamus is going to control things like when we feel alert. We have that mid-afternoon lull, for example, where we don't feel alert, when we're going to start to calm down. And so the hypothalamus is going to help control hormone release and our autonomic nervous system and temperature and things like that. It's going to control that through that suprachiasmatic, because it's near the optic chiasm, the suprachiasmatic nucleus, SCN. So I know these names seem really technical, but they actually do make sense. It's all about positioning in the brain. Once again, the hypothalamus organizes hormone-based behaviors, and here's the only neuroanatomy joke I know. The hypothalamus controls the 4 F's: feeding, fighting, fleeing, and mating, because it controls things like your sex hormones and insulin and cortisol and growth hormone and all the things that kind of help with a regulating through that endocrine system. Once again, what I've done here is I've sliced the brain in half so we can see the brain stem. Here we can see the eyeball and how those neurons are coming back to the hypothalamus. Some of them. Some other ones are going to go to the thalamus so we can get vision. So the SCN is talking about, is it light or dark out? The thalamus is going to help actually start processing what do we see in our visual scene. Okay, so when I cut the brain in half, what we are looking at is actually technically called a mid-sagittal view. And so here's a human being. I could cut or display sections of that human being in different ways. And here's their brain. And what we're doing is we're looking at this green slice, which is a sagittal cut. Here's the eyes, back here's the back of the brain. Here's where the brain stem meets up with the spinal cord underneath. And so that sagittal view cuts right, especially the mid-sagittal, right in the middle, cuts and shows an image of the brain, right, perfect for us because we want to see that brain stem. We sometimes talk about structures being anterior or in front of, or posterior or behind. The top of our head, just like the top of a fish, has a dorsal structure, or sometimes called a superior view, because that's the dorsal fin. That's where we'd put our dorsal fin if we were a shark. And then the ventral view goes down and is if I took your jaw out, I'm not going to do it because I'm not that kind of person, but if I took your jaw out and looked at the underside of your brain, that's the ventral view. So once again, we're mostly looking at mid-sagittal views because they help us see that mid-brain and pons and brain stem and medulla structures. Okay, this is the image the book gives you, which is a drawing, and it does accurately relay what we've been looking at. Here we've got this pons, which is a bulge in your brainstem. Here's your cerebellum. We can see that reticular formation running the whole length of the brainstem up into our midbrain and our diencephalon. Remember our diencephalon? Thalamus, hypothalamus. We've got our suprachiasmatic nucleus, which exists as a substructure within that hypothalamus. I don't quite know why they labeled the diencephalon twice on this. Once again, the diencephalon refers to just that combination of structures, the thalamus and the hypothalamus. We talked about the locus coeruleus. Can you remember what neurotransmitter it uses? Hopefully you thought norepinephrine. So the locus coeruleus is going to be really important for arousal and keeping us awake. And here's the raphe nucleus. Do you remember what neurotransmitter it uses? Hopefully you thought serotonin. So that's our serotonin. There's our norepinephrine. This whole area is very important in regulating sleep and waking. And we're going to introduce one other term, the ventrolateral preoptic nucleus, or the VLPO. Okay, ventrolateral simply means it's on the ventral side. Remember, you take your jaw out, you look up into your brain surface, so it's on the ventral side of the brain. Lateral means it's on the side of this area. Preoptic, it's right by the optic chiasm, which unfortunately isn't diagrammed here. And then nucleus, it's a little bundle of neurons. So it actually makes sense, ventrolateral preoptic nucleus. But if you want to just remember VLPO, that's fine. The VLPO is the major structure in the basal forebrain. And we'll look at more pictures that will help us position where that is in the human brain. But the VLPO basically is what activates sleep. So we think adenosine levels in the VLPO help trigger us falling asleep, and then the VLPO helps basically calm the rest of the brain down by releasing GABA. And remember, GABA is an inhibitory neurotransmitter that calms the rest of the brain down. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is break, and I'll take back up these structures in the next part of my review of this chapter.